Professor Cormack, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Why don't we start with your background? Can you introduce yourself and your career so far, and then what you're doing now?
Sure. I'll tell you something that's really interesting about the way that I see politics is I've been alive in two very different systems. So I was raised in Kansas. I was there through college. That's a state that's never voted to send a Democrat to the presidency. It's a decently Republican state, but it has these sort of what's the matter with Kansas nuances where there's some things that don't really look like Republican states. And then before I ended up in New York City, which is where I am now, and I've been here for 15 years, I did a year in DC. And so I kind of got to see like red territory, DC territory, and then I ended up in New York City where I really like being here. And then when I kind of got into politics or political science, the route that I took was pretty standard. I went to DC, I was a lobbyist for a year. I decided I wanted to know more about this system. And so I ended up going to NYU to get a PhD. While I was at NYU, I worked for Governor David Paterson when he was teaching at NYU as kind of his liaison. And I got to see, like, there's a difference between politics and government and political science and thinking about these sort of things in different ways. And for me at that time, I knew I wanted to teach political science. I knew I wanted to research political science versus a pathway that might have taken me into politics or something like that. Now I find myself at a university called Stevens Institute of Technology. It primarily serves undergraduates, but it has a robust graduate program in engineering departments. And I get to teach college students who mostly are not majoring in political science. Mostly they're doing some sort of engineering degree. And I get to see what it is that they care about, what it is that they focus on. But what really matters to me is what they know or what they think they know. And that's been really illuminating because college students, some of them come in thinking, like, I've already got this figured out and this party's this and that party's that. And this is how it works. And that's generally not true, whatever sort of like ideas they formed at that age. And like breaking it down, letting them research things on their own has been excellent. And it has really kind of changed the trajectory of the research that I'm doing, the things that I think about. And I'm very, very happy to be among undergrads. It's really eye-opening to get to see 18 to 22-year-olds every year confronting these questions about who am I politically? What does it mean to be a citizen? What are these different people doing in Congress? What is the president? I have loved that. And then I think the two other things that kind of like bring me to where I am now as a researcher is I have an 11-year-old daughter. I go to her school and I sometimes teach different components of their politics or their government curricula. Like I'm going there this Monday to do something about the Second Amendment. And it's something where I can see, what lights children up, what sort of things that they think about in politics and sort of the misconceptions they have or the funny ways that they think things work. And so that's been really interesting to me. And then finally, I'm on my local political community board. It's the lowest appointed level of politics in New York City, but I've been doing that for a year now. And so I'm sort of getting to see things at a bunch of different levels. And that's where we are today. That's who I am.
And what drew you in originally in Kansas that attracted you to this space?
I was on the high school debate team, and it was something where I didn't know that I was going to be into politics as much as I was. My parents are like decidedly apolitical. They're kind of this sort where it would be impolite to talk about politics. So it's not something I ever did with them until I was on the other side of a government PhD. And I said, maybe we could talk about these things. And so it's not something that I was really raised with. It's not something that my community really valued. But when I was doing high school debate and then college debate, it's something where I like kind of realized this is an important thing. And we're all playing this game, whether we like it or not. So the least I could do is figure out how it works. And that's been a really motivating force for me. It's just, how is this working? Why is this the system we have? Why are these the outcomes we have? Why are these the people we elect? All those sorts of things really motivate me.
So in terms of your research, you mentioned that you're working with undergraduates and with children. You're also directly involved in some way in the political process. So can you talk through kind of the broad questions that you have for your research? What is the broad area of interest? And then we'll, drill down into the specific areas of your work.
Sure. So the biggest part of my research thus far, the stuff that I've published the most on, the things that I've thought the most on, is all about how Congress communicates what it does to its constituents and how it presents itself. And the sort of tool that I created to research this is a website called dcinbox.com, What it is every member of Congress gets a budget that they can allocate for sort of outreach to their constituents or in their office, however they like. And most of them set up a website and an official e-newsletter where they'll send stuff to their constituents like, hey, I'm coming to the district to do some sort of job fair. Come and see me. Or, hey, we're voting on this piece of legislation. Here's how I'm going to do it. Or, hey, I can't believe the other party is doing this. I hate them. They're such failed people in Congress. All that sort of stuff is interesting to me. And back when I was at NYU, I thought there's got to be a way to look at these things, these communications. They're being made electronically. This is in like 2008, 2009, where I'm like, there's got to be a way to kind of like think about this or research it systematically. And what I found at that time is there wasn't. And I had really good advisors who said, go to Library of Congress, see what's what. I'm sure they have some sort of database. The answer at that time was no. And the answer at that time to this date is no, they don't have an online archive of these things. And instead, DC Inbox, this sort of website that I've built, is where this repository lives. So what it is every member of Congress gets to write to their constituents from a .gov email account in their official capacity and tell them, here's what I'm doing on your behalf. And when I sort of look at those things, you can ask so many questions. You can say, what's the difference between what you say you're doing and what you're actually doing? How is it that there's some sort of elasticity between what you're saying you're doing and what's actually happening? For instance, right now, because we have a split Congress, there's a set of congressional Republicans who say, we passed this legislation, period, stop. And that's true. They did pass it in the House. But the idea that these things are going to pass and then the Senate and get signed by the president is not true. And so there's this like communication piece about like, well, how are we presenting ourselves? Is it something where we're allowing our constituents to really understand what we're doing, or are we giving them a version that's not quite true? And that sort of like elasticity got me into the topic of my first book, which is born out of this focus, which is thinking about how legislators talk about veterans versus how they actually legislate on veterans issues. And so there's so many questions about how Congress communicates to its constituents, and that's sort of like the biggest thing that has motivated me in my research to date. I've looked at how they talk about COVID-19. I've looked about how men and women have been different. And I have many people who are using this database to ask all sorts of questions. How do infrastructure debates happen? What about healthcare debates? What about the extended party network? And so I really love this database. I read 5 e-newsletters every day just so I can see who's who. I have, some people who email in styles that I find really cute, some ones that are annoying, some ones that I think are kind of like nothing, but it's really nice. I mean, I like it. It's something where I get to see the forest and everyone else only ever gets to see their 3 trees, like their 2 senators and their 1 rep, and I get to see them all. So that's sort of like the biggest piece that has motivated most of my research to date. I do have 2 other threads though. As someone who's active in local politics, someone who was here for the implementation, the argument for ranked choice voting in New York City, that has been one that has been deeply interesting to me because I'm living it, because it's affecting the politics in my area, because I think there's promises that are made about ranked choice voting that when they come to bear, they're not quite true. And so that's something where I've been looking at how ranked choice voting, though it might have benefits, also has some drawbacks that are sort of unknown because it's a little bit of an under-researched space in terms of actually being practiced. So for instance, in this last primary where we had ranked choice voting in New York City, only for municipal elections, if we look at the amount of votes that were discarded because they were voided because someone didn't understand the ranked choice voting instructions, either they marked too many people, they marked someone else, came back and marked that person. There's a whole host of ways. Their ballots are then discarded for that election. And that happened more often in places that had lower levels of education overall, higher levels of non-white voters, and lower average incomes. And so I think there's an equity piece of ranked choice voting that we need to address if we're going to adopt this policy, which is you need to educate people about what this is instead of just saying, on this ballot, we do it differently, figure it out. Because I don't think that sort of pre-education piece happened in New York City in a way that I find troubling. We already know that people who are in communities that are poorer on average and lower educated on average don't have as good of representation. Campaign stops don't come there. They don't come there to fundraise. They don't come there to do community things. And so to have them on the margins of actual politics already, and then even further marginalized by having votes thrown out, is something that I hope more people look at, and it's motivating a thread of my research. And then the final one is this piece that is influenced by raising a daughter, being around young adults who have the ability to vote, but oftentimes don't know how. And that's this book project that I'm working on called How to Raise a Citizen and Why It's Up to You to Do It. And the sort of argument here is, after seeing thousands of students over the last 10 years, I know, and studies bear it out, polls bear it out, young people don't vote. And oftentimes we say it's because, they don't want to, or they're doing something else, they're busy. But a lot of times they don't know how to. It's something where they don't know that they have to be registered where they are to participate in this election, or they don't realize that they might be in a closed primary state versus an open primary state, such that if the only election that matters is your primary election, if you're not registered with that party, then you're not participating in it. And so there's all these different things that work against keeping young people out of politics. And I think it's up to us as parents to kind of fill in and let them know all these different important pieces so that they can fully participate. Schools just aren't really equipped to do it at this moment. Schools are under a lot of pressures. They have, pushes to make sure that students are getting good test scores because that helps their ratings. There's this race to have more STEM in the curriculum, and then figuring out what you can take out. And oftentimes civics gets that sort of like boot. And it's something where, if we look at the AP exams, the US AP government exam is the fourth worst tested exam that happens across all of them. Our students do better on chemistry, they do better on physics, they do better on Mandarin than they do on US government. And so we're not teaching it even when we're trying. There's also parents who sometimes can be really hard for schools to deal with, whether it's the threat of litigation or just uproar. And so this is a book that says, look, we have to do this ourselves, and here's how you can do it. Because a lot of parents just really don't feel equipped to this. There's like politeness norms about not talking about politics. There's education gaps where some people haven't, learned what they wish they would have learned in order to raise children in that way. And the last piece is that I think we need to recast the way that parents and adults talk about politics. I think a lot of times we denigrate politicians, we denigrate politics. And when we talk like that, it shapes the way our kids dream. Like, no one is going to say, you know what, I'd love to go into public service. My parents always say that these politicians are crooks and liars. And so my work in this way is hopefully to sort of change that narrative. I don't think politics is all bad. I'm actually really hopeful about politics. But we can't expect our 18-year-olds to just figure it out on their own, because we're not instructing them, and then we're throwing them into the deep end. And so I think that's sort of like the next big thing that I'm working on, but I'm always going to keep DC Inbox as what I'm doing because I think it's just so valuable.
So let's talk a little bit more about DC Inbox to start with. You pulled all these newsletters together. Can you talk a little bit about, some of the statistics around? I mean, how often do they send these newsletters? How many of them actually do it? How long are they? Can you give us kind of an overview of the frequency and the substance of them?
Yeah, so they all have different sort of schedules, and you can tell this is office based. So some people are really good at like saying, I'm going to send one every day. And that's just a staffer who works in the office. Before they leave, they've got to send out that e-newsletter. Most cycles look in between like a week and a month, where some people will say, every 2 weeks, I'm going to send an update. Some people will kind of adopt this. If there's a breaking news or if there's a vote that's going to happen, then I need to talk about it. And so it's really idiosyncratic. It's not systematized across offices. What I can say is Republicans send far more than Democrats, and that has been true since 2010 until today. The only time that wasn't true was at the first few months of the pandemic, where everyone sent a lot more than they ever had in the past. And a lot of that was like, we don't know what we're doing. This seems like it could be dangerous, and we'll try to keep you updated. And then it was, saying, here's the stuff that we know at the federal level. So Republicans send more than Democrats, except for in that one period. Right now in 2023, 86% of representatives have used this free incumbent perk of sending e-newsletters to their constituents. Only 66% of senators have. And that's low for senators in 2023. That's lower than it's been in most of the other years that I've ever had it. And I don't really have a good answer for that, other than the new crop of senators that came in. Very few of them have set them up. There's like a vendor who sets up websites, and a lot of them just don't have toggled on this e-newsletters piece, and they're just like not doing it. So I don't really know what's happening right now in 2023, but in the past, these numbers have been in 80s and 90s for both chambers, with the House always having more people than the Senate. There's other sort of interesting statistics where representatives from the Republican Party, they tend to send way more e-newsletters on the weekend. So Friday, Saturday, Sundays are big days for them, whereas Democrats are Monday through Thursday. That also might be some sort of office staffing thing. I think some of those patterns are curious when I sort of equate Republican sort of party politics with more of this, like, we're going to have some sort of religious rest period over the weekend. That doesn't seem to happen, at least in the scheduling in which their e-newsletters happen. I don't so much associate that with the Democratic Party. But yeah, there's just so much in there to sort of figure out and cut it any way. And that's one of the reasons I like having the database, is anyone can go figure it out. You know, you have these questions: who's talking about this? Who sends these things? It's all figure outable, and it's online in real time for anyone to use.
So how long are they typically in terms of word length? Is it, some people are a single paragraph and others are, writing a thesis? What happens?
Yes, there's everything from little blurbs to stuff that goes beyond what like a Gmail would say, like, hey, this has been clipped, let's click to see the rest of it. Most people fall somewhere in between. So if you're having a little one, it's usually something like, hey, tonight I'm going to be on Fox News, catch me at 7 p.m., and then a link to the show. So that's like an example of a little one that you might send. Oftentimes they'll have, between 3 and 5 paragraphs that kind of says, like, here's what's happening, either like, here's what's happening in Congress, here's who I met with, here's some committee hearings that I had. Oh, and in the district, we're going to have this thing where we're doing a veterans roundtable, or we're going to do some sort of ribbon cutting. And so they usually try to hit a few different pieces. And that's more the norm, though you do see everything in between. You do see teensy tiny ones. You see some that use mostly pictures or image versus text. That's something that's like kind of newish. I also see far more capital letters being used in the last 5 years than had been used prior. And I sort of think this is like a Donald Trump effect, or a spillover on like communications online. But yeah, they vary is the answer for most of this.
Emojis?
Yeah, there's emojis. And there's, if you ever get marketing emails that'll have emojis in the sort of subject line, that is incredibly rare. But on occasion, you'll get like a siren emoji or a megaphone emoji for like an announcement. It's not gone full marketing email stuff yet, but I think some of it, like it certainly starts to mimic other parts of the internet. Like memes have been present in ways that they hadn't been in the past. And so, yeah, it gets there.
And in terms of the audiences for the newsletters, are you able to figure out who they are, how many subscribers they have? Are they all in the district, or is it really a national audience that they're talking to versus, some narrow group within the district?
Yeah, so this is a good question. In 2013, I had a national survey go out that asked people about who'd subscribed to these e-newsletters. And kind of what we found is not that many people do. The highest sort of estimate is for any one district, you might have 17% of your district. I think that's too high. I don't think that's true. I think that's people who are also willing to take political surveys, might be more attuned to doing this. Generally, the audiences are older. Generally, they are more politically interested than not. And generally, that means they also have more extreme sort of partisan or ideological attachments. It, at that time, looked like more Republicans were more likely to read these sort of things than Democrats, which to me is not truly surprising. I think Republicans use these technologies more. I think the audiences tend to be older, and email is still a way to communicate with people. And that has been for a while, such that it's like sort of an older medium versus, we do have legislators who are on Instagram, Snapchat, and Parler, and Rumble, and we have these sort of like younger communication platforms. In terms of their specific constituent counts versus people who are in the national audience, that's hard to tell. A lot of legislators used to say you have to like input your zip code in order to get these. Many of them don't do that anymore. Nearly all legislators that send this are like, if you like this, forward it to a friend. So they want it to reach more people than not. And something that kind of has always sort of colored questions like this for me is one of my advisors, the late Howard Rosenthal. When I first told him about this idea, he was like, are you telling me you're going to study junk mail? And he's not probably totally wrong that in some places, these are just thrown away. Some places, you get them, delete them, whatever, you're done with them. But I know that members of Congress don't treat them like junk mail. I know that members of Congress are using them for their whole communication piece. It's just another platform to them to put their own information out there. And so I no longer think about it as, are you studying junk mail? It might be junk mail for some people, but for the people who are making the content, who are disseminating it, it's certainly not. Despite, an inability to totally figure out how many people are reading it, even on their end.
Can you talk more about now that the content of the newsletters, and does it change by the attributes of the member, or does it change based on, the timing of the year, for instance? What's in these newsletters and what drives what's in them?
Yeah, yes, of course it changes based on who's sending it. You know, some legislators have different orientations where they like try to say no nonsense. So for instance, Steve Cohen, who's a Democrat out of Tennessee, he really relates to his constituents in a very black and white way. He says like, here's this vote, I didn't agree with it, here's why, here's what I would have done differently. Whereas some legislators tend to say like, here's how many times I was in the news. So Marco Rubio, for instance, he will say like, you know, here's a link to this op-ed that I wrote here. Here's one that I wrote here. Then I was on this news show. Then I went to do this radio show. Matt Gaetz in Florida, he'll also sort of do that, where he almost has more of an entrepreneurial style where he'll say like, oh, and by the way, I have a podcast, you should listen to it. And so legislators do have different approaches that all seem to be unique to their own sort of what Fenno might call a home style, where, you know, they're cultivating their own sort of presentation of self and figuring out how they talk to people. And I do find that. In terms of whether or not there's differences across the time of year, the answer is it kind of looks like the congressional calendar. Like when they are on recess, they're doing less of this. I think that's just because they're doing like more in-district things. It's probably less of a concern for their staffers. There are some legislators who 60 days out of a primary or 60 days out of an election will send an email that says like, hey, there are these House guidelines that say I shouldn't have you into this like opt-in thing if it's within 60 days of an election. So I'm going to need to take you out. That's not uniformly adhered to. There's plenty of legislators who don't do that. And then another difference is whether a legislator has a Spanish speaking audience or not. There's a set of legislators who will send an English language one and a Spanish language one. Those are the only languages that are sent and supported right now, despite the fact there's, you know, other languages that are spoken as constituencies. Men and women do a few things differently. At least during the COVID-19 pandemic, women were more likely to focus on topics of school and caring for children and parents than men were. Women also, when I've looked at Congresses in the past, have been more willing to reveal their votes on bills. So, you know, they get to choose what they tell you. They could say, I voted this way or that way. Some legislators do, some legislators don't. And when I looked at that a few Congresses ago, that was something where women were doing more of that than men. That could be different now. But yeah, there's a lot of differences that are related to, you know, who's writing it, who the audience is, how long have they been there. I oftentimes that older legislators don't do as many of these. It's sort of like a younger person's game. It also makes sense to have newer legislators do this because I think they're just so used to doing the email online push in their campaigns that they sort of like roll that into what happens once they're in DC. And so, yeah, there's a lot of differences.
And in terms of the different kinds of content, you mentioned voting, you know, they voted up or down on something and they explain why. What about in terms of legislation that they're proposing? Do they talk about that, like try to justify it or say, you know, try to push it, or, you know, what's the way that they address their own legislative agenda?
Yeah, all the time. A lot of times legislators, they will talk about pieces that are being considered right now, and they'll say like, I've sponsored this or I've co-sponsored this, and then they'll describe why that bill ought be passed. Sometimes it gets a little tricky because, you know, in the modern Congress, smaller pieces of legislation usually like get bundled up into omnibus things or they get adopted via an amendment procedure. And so it's hard for them to say, I had this piece of legislation that we voted on this day, because that's not it's not going to look like that if you went to actually like go figure it out through congress.gov. And so they try to keep it opaque. They don't always use the right titles for things. They don't use wrong titles. But like, for instance, when we were back in the Obamacare era, when they were talking about passing healthcare or not, there were Republican legislators who would write, I'm voting against Nancy Pelosi's socialist medicine bill. That's not the name of the bill. And so sometimes it's like hard to kind of do this one-to-one, what are we talking about, without really having the sort of contextual piece of knowing the Congress and figuring it out. Another big thing that they do, which is not necessarily their legislation, is out parties tend to talk very poorly about the president. So when you have a Democratic president and you have Republicans in the Congress, a lot of the focus is on that person. So it was when Obama was here, it was when Biden was here. Democrats did it to an extent with Trump, but actually Republicans talked about Trump more than Democrats did in positive ways. And so this sort of like, how do we relate to the executive is an interesting question, and they approach that in different ways.
And what about the relationship between the lists they have in their newsletter versus what they have for their campaigns? Like, can they reuse all those names to their campaign email address? Yeah, that database, can they reuse it, or can they bring their campaign over into the official newsletter? And do they get to keep that newsletter after they're out of office?
Yeah, so this is a great question. The answer is no. Like on face, you're supposed to have a firewall between constituents who opt into this and taking that into your campaigning, whether that's for the same office again, whether it's for a state level office, whether it's for the Senate from even to the House. The answer is like, no, you're not supposed to do that. This list is the .gov official list that are people who said, I'd like to talk to my representative, not I'd like to be rolled into you contacting me for the rest of your life. I do find that that happens. And that has happened both with Democrats and the Republicans. And the reason I know and I can like deduce that is the back end of DC Inbox is only ever used and only ever visible to these .gov servers sending these communications. There is no other mail that ever comes to this box at the starting point. And so on an occasion where I get something that's like a legislator who's like Devin Nunes, for instance, he has taken his list from when he was in Congress and he's using it now to talk about the sort of things that he's doing on like the pseudo political business side of things. There was a time when Jackie Rosen out of Nevada was doing the same, and I let every candidate know when this happens. Like I'll contact whoever I can to be like, hey, it looks like there's like a breach in your firewall because this should definitely not be going to these people. And Senator Jackie Rosen out of Nevada, her people were the best at dealing with that. They like stopped their campaign communications to figure out and like deduce where it is that this email list got put into that. Because I mean, it's kind of understandable in some ways. You're dealing with big lists. You have staffers who are working for you both officially and then campaigns just at different times of the day or different locations. But it is like something that House policy says you're not meant to do. And I think good governance wise, you're not meant to do, because it would really be unfortunate if people were like, I'd like to know what my politicians do, but no one wants to get campaign emails for the rest of their life. That's not good for anyone. And so it's not supposed to happen. It does happen on occasion. I try to always highlight it when I do. It happens more on the Republican side than it does on the Democratic side, reasons for which I don't know. But that does seem to happen.
And when we're talking about like the newsletters and who gets them, you can imagine a newsletter where there were no hyperlinks in it, right? It's just purely unidirectional. Then there's another option, which is, you have a link, you have a call to action of some kind inside the newsletter, right? And that call to action could be, as you said, Mark Rubio's on Fox or whatever, and he wants you to look at that. You could also imagine a scenario where they asked a survey, or they say, hey, how do you feel about this bill? Click on this, and it opens up a box, and then they give their feedback on that bill or on that issue. Do you see those types of, two-way communications being fostered by this method?
Yes, they do these sort of like unscientific surveys where they say like, what do you think about this, or what should I prioritize? That happens. That's actually something that's happening less now than it was 5 years ago. Every morning around like 9 a.m. on my Twitter, I try to point out like a new thing that's happening. And I focused on surveys a few months ago, where it was something where that used to be far more often, is you'd say like, what do you think on this issue? I think those things are kind of tricky for them, because if they link to the answers, and if you have more people who prefer something different than you actually want to vote or than what you prefer, that puts you into like a sticky, weird area. It's also something where it wouldn't take that much coordination from some sort of pocket on the internet to have everyone go flood your survey and have it look, counter to the way you'd want it to turn out. And so I don't think they're strictly that useful for members of Congress. They sometimes will point to it and be like, in our survey last week, 78% of you said I should vote yes, so I'm voting yes. But that's not the norm. That sort of two-way stuff is not. It's less and less common now than it was 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah, and I guess there's not really any specific platform they could link to other than like a survey kind of platform that's sort of like a civic engagement for the member, right? Even a virtual town hall or something might be still, there's not like one single place where you can go to have that interaction between you and the member.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, they do push to their social media. They will say, go follow me on Twitter, see me on Instagram, see me on Rumble. I'm in Parler to like they do sort of push you to other platforms, but yes, there's not a unified platform for everyone to go to. And they do what you just said. They do have, here's my tele town hall. We're going to do this tonight. Send your questions. And that happens from time to time. Usually that corresponds to like in district periods, but it's less than it used to be.
And how do they get subscribers? Is it just like go to Congress their profile on Congress, or is it they're actively collecting people's names and sending them stuff? Is it pure spam like you mentioned before, where they just try to guess everyone's email address in their district and then and then put them on the list?
That's certainly not the way. Originally, when this started, when there was like the very nascent, can members of Congress send you emails? What people would do is they would handwrite postcards with their email accounts on it and send it to Congress, and then Congress could use those emails. Now there's sort of like two main ways that you sign up for these. You either go to the member's website directly, and then if you I mean, pick your member, it doesn't matter who. If it's in the House, if you go there, there's only like 4 or 5 vendors or sort of setups for the way their websites look. Usually you'll get a pop-up that's like, sign up for my email, and then you'll have something that slides from the bottom and it's like, sign up for my email. And then on occasion you'll have ones who don't prioritize it so much, but many of them do want your email address. So that's like way one. And way two is if they do have a call to action. So if they do have something that says like, take this survey, usually you'll have to submit your email address to do that. And then they'll have a little disclaimer that says, by doing this, you're opting in to receive communications from my office. And sometimes with that mode, they'll have something that says like, if you think your friend or family is interested in this, send it along to them. And so then you sort of do that snowball for them. It goes to someone else, and then they'll have another person on their list. But no, they don't inherit lists like, when I come into office, whoever had it before. There are legislators who I know take their lists from the time they're in the House to the Senate. And the way that I sort of know this is our systems here, in terms of like, if a member moves from the House to the Senate, they get set on a list for like, we need to go resubscribe to these things. And sometimes they'll beat us to it and they'll just start sending stuff. And it's like, oh, okay, so you still have those lists because we haven't subscribed to the Senate yet.
And do the email newsletters fall under the franking regulations or anything like that, or is it just a free market basically?
No, yeah, they're definitely governed by House rules that look like franking. So, like, for instance, in franking, you can't send anyone a direct message that says like, "Happy birthday to so and so, who's a big deal in the community," or "Let me recognize this thing." You also can't ask for votes. You can't say like, "You should support me at this election." You can't ask for money, and so there's rules on sort of what they can do. Theoretically, if you like look at the documents that are governing these, they're not supposed to be explicitly political. That is something that no one seems to regard anymore. There was like a period of time when I first started this where I thought like, oh, this medium is very reasonable. This is very like, here's what we're doing and why. And from about like 2011 onwards is not reasonable, or it's not apolitical. It's not political. So it's a lot of like taking shots at the other side.
But they can ask them to go to their other kind of social media outlets where they have more freedom to communicate in the way
They can totally do that. And many of them do it in their header. It'll say like, connect with me on, and then it'll have the icon. It'll have like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Snapchat, Instagram, and they'll push them to wherever else they think they can do that. And yeah, you're right. In those areas, there's not the same sort of limits. There are sort of rules and norms that govern if you are using your official account. So like, say a member on Twitter has their official account and then they have their campaign account. From their official account, they're not meant to ask for votes or money. And I don't study those platforms enough to know if that doesn't happen, but I know that norm is meant to hold.
Right. So if we take a step back and just think about constituent communications, generally speaking, for a minute, I know this is an area of your broad interest, right? So can you talk through kind of the questions that you have about constituent communications, and what have you found in your research? What answers have you what have you learned through that process?
Sure. So some of the big questions are like starting simple and then getting more complex. So one of the like base question is like, who is pushing different news onto their audience? So like, we all know that there's different pathways that people understand politics, government, the world around them. And some legislators will say like, go look at this. And so a lot of times they'll say, read this op-ed, go read this story, go check out this segment on whatever. And so it's kind of like, what is it that they want their audiences to know? That's kind of like this communication piece broadly, because it's, in an ecosystem of other communications. But in terms of like specific members of Congress questions, there's questions about like who's saying something in a lip service way versus who's doing something in sort of a legwork way, is what I call it. And the first time I really got into this was on the topic of veterans politics. So when you read these newsletters, is as much as I have, or at least when I started doing this, I realized everyone talks about veterans all the time. And that's something where, like, I sort of understood that when I was in Kansas. I was surrounded by many more veterans. Fort Leavenworth wasn't too far. It was just something where there was more of that in my life. In New York City, you have districts where there's very few veterans, like fewer than 4% of the constituencies are veterans. But I kind of found this, like, uniformly, everyone's talking about veterans. What's that about? And so when I looked at it deeper, it's not strictly true that everyone's talking about veterans, that Republicans talk about veterans a ton. Democrats do as well, but Republicans do it a lot more. So I thought to myself, I was like, okay, well, they must be like the people who like legislate on behalf of veterans. This must be like their core constituency. And what I found, at least when we're looking at from like 1940 till today, actually Democrats do a lot more legislating on behalf of veterans. And what I mean by that is they're more apt to both introduce legislation and have that legislation passed that is supportive of veterans in ways that we sort of understand today. So when we think about like the construction of the VA, when we think about how VA healthcare is modeled and how many other VA programs are, they look a lot closer to what some would call socialistic. They recognize that the government has a role to play in people's lives, that there is some sort of dependency that can exist in those sort of systems. And that can be sometimes harder to square away with Republican ideology generally, despite the fact that there is sort of an exception for veterans as sort of these, like, atypical, really worth it to do these sorts of policies for. And so what I kind of find is that at least in the veterans space, there's some interesting party changes where, like, Democrats tend to be doing a little bit more there, but they don't talk about it as much. And they simply don't recognize veterans as an audience that really matters to them as much as Republicans do. Not to say that they don't, because they're doing the legislation. It's just not their communication strategy. There is an area where this, I think, might change in the next few years. I was sort of hawkish that it would change faster than it is, but something that's really interesting is the bipartisan nature of veterans. So veterans don't have an anti-veteran lobby. Republicans like them and Democrats like them. And there are a set of different sort of treatments that are coming online that seem like they might be promising for veterans that are in like the psychedelic medicine space. And that's something where, a lot of politicians don't necessarily want to touch dealing with those sort of psychedelic drugs. There's like associations with like hippies from the 60s and 70s. But there are Republican members of Congress who have come out, Republican members of Congress from Texas, who have said, like, look, veterans are suffering from PTSD, addiction, alcoholism, and there's nascent clinical trials that say, like, these psychedelic drugs might be an answer for some of these sort of ailments. So maybe we should think about doing that. And that's something where, like, AOC on the left has talked about doing it as well. So I do think there's some really interesting stuff that I've been able to find by following the veterans thread that I wouldn't have been able to do had I not started at this communication piece. There is, a host of other questions, like how men and women are different, that the answers are, sort of more straightforward. But I think sort of like following the threads and finding the different paths has been the stuff that's really interesting to me and something that keeps me coming back to this database.
So, beyond things like veterans, are there other kind of topics where there's a big disconnect between, the rhetoric and the reality on the Hill?
There's definitely big disconnects that I have less ability to say, here's how it's different on the Hill. But one thing that's like really apparent right now is Republicans are much, much, much more likely to talk about fentanyl and fentanyl opioid related overdoses, challenges for policing than Democrats are. We know that fentanyl is in all US states. It's in every congressional district. We know that deaths are up kind of everywhere, but it is something where Republicans are far more likely to talk about this than Democrats are. Whether or not they're more likely to do something legislatively is a piece that I can't answer because I haven't looked into it, but it is stark in terms of the willingness for Democrats to not talk about this at all or just not prioritize it in their sort of communications. But in the same sort of way, there's a set of other concepts that Republicans are just more likely to talk about. So like the idea of wokeness or using woke politics. No Democrats ever send a newsletter that say, like, today I was woke and I'm going to believe this position. They don't talk like that. But Republicans do use it as kind of like a pejorative to say, like, this is a challenge. These woke politics are ruining our military. or things like defunding police is something where Republicans tend to talk about that more than Democrats. And on the flip side, there's a few, words that Democrats will use that Republicans never use, like xenophobia. That's a Democratic word. That's one that they use. Stuff like equity, looking at like childhood hunger. Those are things that Democrats tend to focus on versus Republicans. But the link between, how that's getting legislated is something that I don't know that I can speak to with any sort of confidence because I haven't really looked at what those legislative pieces are on those things. I've been more focused on the communication.
And what about in terms of like the timing of the releases of certain kinds of bullet points, if you will? So you have leadership, the Republican or Democratic leadership, they come up with some kind of, we're all going to think X. Now everybody go out and put that out in your communications. Does that happen? Can you see that kind of roll through the whole Congress, a particular talking point, and when it starts and when it kind of ends as some kind of campaign?
Yeah, you can. And anyone can if they have one that they're looking for. Yeah, you can find these. One that I found, I think just yesterday or the day before, was the idea that the border is really, we're calling it Biden's border crossing, or Biden's border crisis is what Republicans are calling it. And then there's sort of this like framework for how you describe to your constituents how dangerous it is. So one way that they've been setting this up is, since Biden has taken office, there have been 6 million immigrants who have come across the border. That's X times as many as is in our district, or that's X times as many as is in our state. And they're trying to like contextualize it so that you could like understand that relative to your own sort of population. There's also been a way that we talk about like fentanyl that's come from China into Mexico, into the United States, to say there's enough fentanyl that's here that it could kill the whole world multiple times over. And that sort of like ways to frame these things. Yes, you can see those permeate. That sort of stuff happens way more consistently on the Republican side and has from 2010 onwards than the Democratic side. And part of it might be, their comms team is just more coordinated. They understand sort of like a centralized, like, here's how we're doing it, and it comes from the top down. Democrats might be like a little bit more of the herding cat styles, like I talk about what I want and I maybe don't listen to leadership. The structure doesn't just like pay as much, they don't pay as much attention to that structure. So yeah, you can see these things. It's oftentimes far more visible from Republican legislators than Democratic legislators because they seem to be more coordinated on the Republican side for communications.
And have you been able to compare the newsletter style, content, timing, et cetera, with other kinds of channels that come out from the members? So we talked to Annalise Russell a few weeks back, who focuses on the tweets, right? And then there's the there's what they might say, when they're at their town halls, et cetera. Have you been able to look at if there's a qualitative or quantitative difference between what they're doing with their newsletters versus their other channels?
Yeah, actually, just this last year in 2022, I published something with Rachel Bloom and Kelsey Shube, and it was looking at how they have used press releases, e-newsletters, Facebook posts, and Twitter. And we kind of, we had the 114th, 115th, 116th Congress. So we had 6 years, and we said, we're going to like see how they're doing this across different mediums. And what we kind of find is that they understand that these mediums are for different purposes. They have different audiences. And so in e-newsletters, they tend to have far more of this sort of like parochial constituency-based stuff, like these ribbon cuttings, roundtables, job fairs, coming here to do like a coffee on your corner, whatever. That sort of stuff is never in press releases. That sort of stuff is rarely in Twitter. And so, that's kind of thinking about who your audiences are and what kind of action you can compel them to do. Twitter seems to be the more national facing sort of medium where it's like, you're not just talking to your constituents, you're doing a little bit more of this partisan taunting. You're trying to like engage in ways that you get retweeted or you get quote tweeted or people reply to you. And that's just like not an incentive structure in the e-newsletters because there's not a metric that says, how many times did someone forward this? No one cares. It's not real. Whereas in Twitter, that's sort of like the game is you want to have people engage with your things. Facebook, stuff gets very weird on Facebook. I think stuff gets weirder on Facebook than on Twitter because it's longer form. And so they can just like say more on topics. They can get into like deeper dives. They can post videos of themselves doing like Facebook things. And then press releases are tame, and press releases tend to be policy related. Like press releases are like, there's this policy, this is a problem, or there's this policy, I think we should vote for it, whatever. And so, yeah, they have different institutional sort of understandings about what these mediums should do for them. We don't find that anyone has like four radically different personas. There's not like, this person's really quiet on this one and they're crazy over here. That's not really what happens. It's pretty consistent in how they do it, but it is clear that they like do things differently. And some people value some mediums more than others. Some people never use e-newsletters. They have constituencies who they don't think read these, and so that's fine. And some people are really infrequently active on Twitter, and that's sort of, if you have a huge sort of legislative body, it's not surprising that some people prefer one way to another.
I'm curious about how they communicate related to Congress's process, right? So obviously there's introducing the bill, then there's voting, right? That's kind of the beginning and end of the process. What about, the committee hearings or markups, or, I'm on X committee and we're talking about this, how do they communicate that process oriented piece, and whether they're attacking it or whether they're saying that they're being constructive in it, or that kind of thing?
So some of them get really into the weeds. Some of them will say, so like Congressman Mann, he's in Kansas 1. He is getting ready to chair his first or second agricultural subcommittee meeting. And that was a big deal for him. He was like, I'd like to tell my constituents that I'm going to do this. And then he kind of walks through what happens in a committee process. It just sort of depends on the person. No one really says like, I can't believe this is getting, in committees. They don't like say, this is too slow or we need to fast track this. That's not really something that I ever see. But they have different tolerance levels for how much they want to talk about that, which makes sense to me because plenty of people don't care about that, or they like don't have the ability to really piece it in their brain to say like, oh, this happens before that. And so in terms of committee hearings, they'll tell you that they're happening if they care to do it. They love to say as the chairperson or as the chairman or as the chairwoman. So they really like to tout when they're running the show. And then there's sort of process things that get lost. So some of the process stuff that gets lost is like, what does it mean when a bill passes one chamber? It means pretty much nothing. There were legislators who maybe 2 years ago passed a bill to make it so that we were not going to have daylight savings. And they communicated like, oh, we're not going to do daylight savings time anymore. And I had plenty of college educated professor level people who said like, oh, we're not doing this anymore. I was like, no, no, no. One chamber said we're not doing this anymore, but we need two in the president. And so like the ways that they do this, I think probably matter in that they might sort of accidentally fool some people into thinking that something's happening. I don't think they intend to deceive people, but I think if you recognize, hey, we passed this thing, but it's not going to work because the other side's not going to agree with us, and then the president's going to veto it, that kind of takes the wind out of your sails. And so they usually try to paint the like most positive picture of like, we did this thing, despite the fact that that thing might actually never amount to anything because there's other pieces in the government that have to agree.
So have you thought about the constituents from the other side? And maybe that's what you're doing in part through your Raising a Citizen book, right, that you're working on, which is, how do the citizens in a district, how are they perceiving the member, right? What channels are they collecting that information from? How are they judging the performance of that member compared to the context of the other members, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean that's a harder question for me in a lot of ways because I can think about experimentally, you could set a bunch of these e-newsletters in front of people and say like, what do you make of these, or like which do people prefer? And so there's like certainly ways to figure it out from the like, how do these communications work effectively? I think though what it tends to be is you have constituents or electorates or selectorates that matter to these legislators, then you have those who don't. And so I think most of them are pretty good at fine-tuning communications to match the style that they think their constituents want to hear. So for instance, Representative Gosar out of Arizona, he is really inflammatory in his e-newsletters. I mean, he's sent pictures of US generals in drag makeup saying like, here's what Biden's going to do to our military. That's not stuff that if he was a New England Republican, I don't think that's like stuff that would work with those audiences. And those legislators who are that don't do that. And so I think they really match up, and it's hard to like get on that assessment piece of how do their constituents think about it, because I think most people who are elected to Congress have at least a sense of what they think their constituents are going to want. People who are really out of step, might find themselves no longer in Congress. But while they're in here, while they're able to send these .govs, I think they pretty much match as well as they can. And I haven't done research on the other side of it to figure out if that's true or not, but I don't have a reason to believe it's not true.
So can you talk more about your Raising a Citizen project?
Sure. So after writing my first book, I sort of learned a little bit about the process for myself and what does it take to get into something. And what I found is like thinking about a topic that motivates you to wake up in the morning, think about it more, do some stuff on it, fall asleep thinking about it is the way to go. And that's where this project is for me. So, How to Raise a Citizen is not going to be an academic book. It's not going to be one where a university press publishes it. It's going to be one where the audience is meant to be much more public facing. It's something where it should be generalized. It's not going to be jargony. It's going to be something where I want to give people sort of a primer on what things you need to know to tell your kids this and how to have those conversations. Because I think, at least for my generation and some above me, there are modes of parenting that are we don't talk about politics, we don't talk about sex, we don't talk about religion, maybe a few other things. I think what we're finding, at least on the sex front, is like if you don't talk to your kids about this, someone else will. And that might be the internet. That might not be as good as if you were able to do this in sort of a reasonable way. And I think about politics and government in a similar manner, where like your children will learn about this, or they won't, which is detrimental in its own ways. But if you can kind of give them paths and tools to do this from an early age on, then it's not as gargantuan as a task when they're 18. If they kind of understand that, you have to register in some places to vote, or you have to have this sort of ID to be able to do it, or you have to have this many days, that's helpful. I also think there's sort of these background pieces that are helpful, which is like, who's responsible for what? If you're mad at the way that your potholes are, that's not a presidential issue. If you think your trash pickup should happen more often, that's something a city council person gets involved in. And so it's kind of thinking about these different pieces. Now, if you're mad that like you can no longer compete in this sport because there's some sort of gender discrepancy that your state level is dealing with, that's a state issue. And so I think those pieces matter. And something that I think our schools tend to focus on is more of a historical situating of US democracy. When we talk about the founding fathers and we talk about different pieces that are relevant to that state's sort of history. So, the way they're learning this in Texas is different than in Kansas, than in New York. And that stuff is all like good information to have. But that information doesn't allow 18-year-olds to participate as citizens. It doesn't matter if they can say, here's what manifest destiny is, or I can name all the founders. That doesn't let you register to vote. That doesn't let you participate in politics. That doesn't let you know who you should reach out to in case there's a challenge. And I also think demystifying politics is a much better thing than keeping it as like, oh, you learn it when you're older, or when it matters to you, you figure it out. So my daughter has met our city council person. She can meet any legislator that I'm in contact with. She comes to community board meetings on occasion and she sees what that looks like. And I think that's good because I think we want to have children who want to do this, whether or not she's one of those. I think by keeping this as a process or a place where it's like adults only and they're all bad or they're all liars, that's not great. That's not good for democracy moving forward. The more people who understand the system that we're all playing in, whether we like it or not, the better. And the more people who understand it and care enough to make it work more functionally, the better. And so I'm really excited about this project overall because it's something I truly believe in. It's something that I think, I'm not blaming kids for not knowing stuff. No one taught them. And I'm not blaming our set of parents right now for not knowing stuff because in a lot of instances, no one taught them either. But it's something that we all can't really afford to ignore because I think there's really dire consequences to having a whole population who's either disconnected from politics, misinformed on politics, or just thinks it's not worth their time. I think we're actually a better, stronger country if we have people who care, are reasonable, able to rationally discuss these things out and come to compromise solutions.
You mentioned in the beginning that you got into the whole political realm and political science generally because of the debate, right? Because of your debate experience. How does that play into your thought process here? Because a lot of times what you see is, at least the trend seems to be more hardening of positions, right? And less compromise, less listening. And I would presume in the debates that you were involved with, there was listening and then responding to the other side instead of talking to yourself. So how does that play into your thought process now when it comes to this book?
Yeah, I think there's a few different ways to think about what debate needs to accomplish. And I think, that's different on an interpersonal level versus on a congressional level, whatever. But I think there's two basic things. There's debating to win. There's debating to show like, I have a better argument than you. And that's fine in some settings, especially competitive debate when we're honing that skills. In a courtroom, in any sort of like legal background stuff, that's fine. Contracts, yes. But then there's also a debate to get to an outcome that works for both of us. And I think that's actually far more useful in many contexts and certainly in the government context. Like the idea that whoever has the better argument wins these elections, and then they get all their policies, but then maybe on it's going to be another side and they're the winners and they're the losers. That's far less functional, and there's less continuity in that than if we could say, hey, we're going to debate these things out. There's challenges on both sides. There's good parts on both sides, and let's figure out compromise solutions so that we can move this forward. And I think that's actually better, but it's certainly less sexy. And it's something where the incentive structures right now of what it takes to get media time, what it takes to get people following you on Twitter, or what it takes to just get this sort of cultural cachet is not, I'm a bipartisan, reasonable person who's trying to put things forward. And I think until we sort of change that underlying incentive structure in our politics, it's not going to be surprising that we find these like sort of hardened polls to people who are just like, I want to win. That's not the way I think about politics. I think we all sort of like win in a better, though less straightforward way if we can kind of give and take. If we can like think, oh, this works here, but not here. Or maybe we need to adapt this thing. I think a really easy way to sort of see how these policies have like good and bad is in the marijuana legalization policy space, which happens, kind of piecemeal across the states. Federal government is dragging its heels. There's a lot of state operators now who have challenges because they can't avail themselves to the federal banking system. And it's something where it's like, oh man, we're making a system because you want to win or you want to win. But really, we're going to have some problems if we can't figure this out together. And so I think of the two ways that debates can sort of play out, to win or to have something that works for all of us, having something that works for all of us is a much better outcome. And it's hard to see how we get there without changing some of the incentive structures.
And so your book is targeted at parents, I presume, of what's the audience that you're targeting for it exactly?
So I think you can have these conversations kind of at any time. Like I think you can start really young, but people who are thinking about having kids, who are raising kids, if you have an under 18-year-old, or if you were someone who was like, I'm going to be an aunt or an uncle in this person's life, and I know their parents aren't really into politics, but maybe this is a role for me. I think there's space for all adults to be able to talk about politics with all children in reasonable ways. And I think it's actually kind of dire in the sense that there's many political issues that spill over into the way that children's lives turn out in ways where keeping them in the dark doesn't make sense. So for instance, my daughter and I were talking thankfully at a school in an urban center that doesn't really have a lot of gun violence because we don't have a lot of gun prevalence in our area. But that doesn't mean she's immune to hearing it on the news, and she can't really make that nuanced sort of set of considerations like, oh, that generally doesn't happen here, because that's just too much. But being able to talk about like, well, these are policy decisions. There are some sort of like foundational bits of our Constitution that make discussing these things harder than just like, oh, let's change it. But sort of working through the like what's possible here really makes it so that those things are possible in the future, knowing that like all we're doing here is a big human experiment. We're all just collective decision making and group decision making. And so kind of like figuring those things out early on, I think is really good. But when you start to like make the strides on like, here's how you become this, that's something that happens, in that push from like 12 to 18. And it's taking them to things, it's showing them, everyone knows that if you take a child to vote with you, they're far more likely to vote themselves because it's not mystifying. It's not scary in any way. It's like, oh, here's how you do this. And so it's people who are raising kids who are on their way to being adults, but not yet there.
Great. Well, let's move on to the ranked choice voting program you have, or the questions that you have. Can you talk us through a little bit more about their, ranked choice voting? What have you seen? What are you concerned about? Where are the opportunities?
Yeah, ranked choice voting is interesting because I think in a lot of ways it's very seductive. I think a lot of people think, oh my gosh, if I can make more choices, then we'll all be able to make better choices. And I think one of the reasons that sort of is intuitively true is because a lot of people don't like the idea of it's this or that. Like I feel like I'm picking for the lesser of two evils, but I just get to pick one. And so the idea that you get to pick more, I understand that initially as something that's sort of like seductive, where it's like, oh, that sounds great. I think in practice, how ranked choice voting sort of plays out is far more complicated. I think there are sort of unpredicted outcomes that can be made more likely under ranked choice voting than not. And I'll give you an example just from sort of the district that I'm in. So in the district that I'm in, it's nearly 70% registered Democrats. The Democratic primary is where the election is. And so we only have ranked choice voting in New York City for municipal primaries. So that's really the only place that it matters. In our district, we had 5 people who were running. You can rank up to 5. And then we had a 6th jump in at the end. The 6th was the most well-funded, not really rooted in the district as much, but the most well-funded and had done other things in other parts of the place. And the 5 who were the originals, they didn't quite know how to coordinate, and they were all afraid to coordinate. So a lot of times people will say ranked choice voting makes for better politics because, if you'll say, if not me, vote for this person. That's not really what happened in the New York City experience time 1. And I don't think we're going to see it in times 2, 3, and 4 and whatever. It didn't really happen at the mayoral level because in order to win a ranked choice voting election, the best way to do it is to win the most votes that you can in term 1 or in round 1. And so the sort of like playbook of like, let me just say my name still sort of works. So the idea that it gives its promises, like, they all come to fruition. I don't think that's true. But I do think there's like secondary impacts, which is sometimes it means that balloting is much harder to do than it is if you're just having a pick one election. So, from a very simple like space usage point, instead of just having one sort of bullet point that you have to put a little dot in, now you have, we had in between like 3 and 12 candidates in all of our city council races. There's more people who run, and so you have more choices. That's more opportunities to mismark a ballot. That's more opportunities to have something voided. And at least in New York City's first time, there's real challenges with equity, where there were people who had their ballots thrown out in ways that if we look at how they voted the last few times around, at least in those districts, that didn't happen. And so I think there's concerns about like having some people not be able to participate as fully as everyone else. This isn't to say ranked choice voting is necessarily a bad change. I just don't think it's this. I know it's not a panacea. I know it doesn't change your politics to be like, oh, it's all great, we all ranked choice voted, everyone's happy with this outcome. That's not true. And so I think it's something that it needs more scrutiny. It's not something that we should all just like openly embrace and say like, yes, this is the right way to do it. It needs more scrutiny. And that's sort of where I sit on it. And that's the work that I'm doing at the local level. We also had challenges about like voter security. So our Board of Elections, they released the cast vote records. And in some precincts, you only had one person from the Republican Party who voted. And then they also released who voted. And so we were able to match, a colleague and I were able to match like 374 people exactly to how they voted. We shouldn't be able to do that. But that sort of stuff where it's like, well, if you didn't think this through and you're, releasing these 2 levels of data in 2 different ways, yeah, you can figure it out on occasion. And that shouldn't be.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, in terms of the timing, I think it's time for us to move on to the next phase where I ask you questions that we've asked all our guests, if you're ready to move on.
Let's do it.
All right. The next question is really, what do you think congressional representation should mean? And that means your personal opinion on whether, a representative represents just their primary voters, everybody in the district, all the future generations, and how they would do that representing, is it the delegate or the trustee model?
Yeah, so I think a representative should be whatever its constituents want it to be. And what I mean by that is its constituents that participate in the process of selection. So if you're in a closed primary state where, you have a great majority of voters who are registered with one primary or one party, you need to do whatever gets the most of those people on your side. Does that mean once you've won a general election, you can totally ignore the other partisans or the non-partisans in your constituency? Normatively, it might not mean that you should, but I'm kind of okay that it does. We get the outcomes that our systems create. And so I think if people are unhappy with their representatives, sometimes it can be about changing the representatives, but sometimes it can be about changing the systems. And so I think sort of like, we get the people that our systems allow for. And I don't really have a problem with the different representational styles that we have originating from different systems. So my answer is, kind of whatever constituents want it to be. And that's sort of borne out in like the systems they're willing to tolerate and keep in place.
So if I understand you correctly here, what you're saying is that the ones who vote the person in, that the representative should reflect their views.
I mean, they need to reflect the views of the people that they need to win. The idea that they're meant to like fold in the views of people who they didn't get, that's sort of like, I understand that as like a good outcome from some sort of like bigger picture, what are we doing here? But I wouldn't fault representatives who don't do that, because that's not what this incentive structure is. That's not what they need to be successful in this system.
Right, but this is a should question, and this is your personal opinion of what they should do. So are you saying they should follow what those voters want, or they should represent the whole district?
No, I think in my should of this, I'm sort of agnostic and saying like you should do what your system permits. If your system permits you to ignore a set of people, I understand it if you do that. Now, is that the best politics ever? No. If I could rewrite it, yes, I would. But in the world that we live in right now, I understand that as fine representation.
And so it sounds like, in addition to that mode of the voters that get you in office, it's also their belief system that you would think that they should vote rather than what the representative judges in their best interest. So the judgment portion of the representative is more limited, and they should reflect more what the voters say they want.
I mean, probably in terms of like whether it's a trustee or a delegate or a politico. In terms of what a legislator does, I think it's a determination on how they want to be effective. And there's some people who really just want, I'd like someone to bring home the bacon. I want someone who can legislate and give me earmarks or sort of like carve outs for whatever I want. I think that's probably good politics and good government in systems that permit that. And so I understand it when legislators kind of like say, here's what my constituents want, even if that might not be their own personal want or desire there. I think that's probably fine with me.
All right. Next question is about congressional time. So, how would you allocate it? Would you make them be in DC all the time, in the district all the time, dialing for dollars all the time? How would you break their time down?
Yeah, I think the reality of this is that the fundraising piece of always being up for reelection is the biggest challenge. Like, if every legislator knows they have to raise money because they're going to be up in 2 years in the House or 6 years in the Senate, I think that's like the biggest problem. I don't begrudge any member of Congress for having to spend time on that now. I think there's better uses of time. If I could redo this system, I think it'd be something where there's like a publicly funded limited use of money that says here's what we do to campaign and it's guaranteed to X many candidates per congressional district. So I would like to have that time allocated away from the fundraising piece. Call time I think is sort of problematic. In terms of whether you're in the district or in DC, that's much harder. There's people who live in Maryland and Virginia. They could be home each night if they really wanted to, whereas someone who's in Alaska or California, that's a harder thing. I don't really have a problem with the way that our recess system is set up right now. I think we have a decent amount of in-district time and DC time. I also don't strictly worry about people being in DC for too long and then being out of touch with their constituents. I think that's a balance each member of Congress has to like sort of figure out. Some people just, they have more ties, better staff, understanding like threads in their own constituencies, and some people who don't, if they're new to a place, they probably got to spend more time there. But in terms of like how they're allocating it right now, I think the DC district time split, I don't have a problem with. I think it's the day to day that you have to do call time is probably the biggest problem. And I doubt I'm alone in thinking that. I don't know that anyone really likes that.
All right. Next question is how should debate, deliberation, or dialogue occur or be structured in Congress?
I think the more in person for all of these things, the better. I think some of the best discussions that happen are in committee pieces or committee work because we have people who are having to look at each other, talk to each other, study something together. The positions could be known prior to going in. They can deliberate it in person then, and then you get some sort of like actual debate that happens and outcomes that can be different. I think the way that dialogue happens sometimes for C-SPAN is performative. Or if we have like 1 minute speeches that are performative, I understand they have like a role to play. It's representational. You're saying, here's what my constituents think, whatever. That doesn't get us to better outcomes necessarily because it's not as good as in-person to person collective decision making. But I also think there are soft things that Congress could do to sort of make all of these things easier, which is, like you'll hear about like congressional baseball games, or you'll have like Democrats versus Republicans or softball games. I think what would be better is if we had sort of like mandated cross aisle buddies where it was like, no, this is going to be a congressional baseball game where half of these people are Democrats and half of these people are Republicans, and they're on the same team and they're playing against this other team, which is half Democrats and half Republicans. I think some of that like softer social stuff that could happen across party lines is better. I think some of the new members of Congress are good at recognizing that and saying like, I'm in the problem solvers caucus or I'm going to do these things. So in person, bipartisan, and sort of like non-performative is the way that we probably get to better outcomes. And it's just sort of reducing the platforms that encourage performative or not in person or online sort of modes that would make things better.
What's your thought on the transparency element of that then? So in committee, all these things are or most of them are transparent, and that's been criticized as a potential problem for collegiality or getting things actually done and leading to that performative aspect you mentioned. Does that mean you think that if it's possible to get more things done if it's in a private setting, that would be area should be expanded?
Oh, so like closed door committee meetings versus public committee meetings, is that what you mean?
Things like that, or caucuses, where it's not necessarily public.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know that it has to be one or the other, full stop. We already have structures that permit some of these to be closed doors and some of these to be open. But I think the idea of more togetherness is better. The transparency piece, you can have minutes and records of meetings, or you can have people there. Cameras are a problem. So like cameras are not necessarily all a problem, but I think they do add this performative element. We know that when people are in front of an audience, they're different than when they're not. And so there's probably some components that need to stay public. And then there's some that are probably better hashed out if they're not having cameras or public eyes watching them, but you can understand what happened via minutes or some sort of record keeping procedure.
Yeah. Right. Next question is, what fundamental institutional improvement should Congress make within 50 years?
I think there should be something where we structure success as a measure of bipartisan agreement rather than a measure of my side wins and your side loses. I think the idea that bipartisanship is not something to campaign on. It's not something to use as a notch in your sort of look how experienced I am. I can do this across the aisle. I think that's problematic. And I would love it if that sort of piece came with a new set of congressional institutional changes that happen with new legislators. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to make it so the most successful legislators are the ones who get stuff done and be the ones who use allies from the other side. But I do know that we have had a Congress that looked like this, and we mostly had a Congress that looked like this from, say, the 1920s to the 1970s. So I understand that it's possible to get there. I don't quite know how we get there, but the idea that you have to be winning for your party at the expense of the other party all the time is problematic in a way where you can't get to good, commentable outcomes. But if we do see, people who are willing to cross party aisles, not as traitors, but more as facilitators for agreement, that would be better. And part of that could be congressional leadership. Part of that could be a willingness to say, we're not going to hold the idea that we're not going to fund part of your campaign if you do this thing, but instead giving a little bit more wiggle to say there are areas where when we compromise, it's better, and letting people do that.
Next question is, what book or article most shaped your thinking with regard to congressional reform?
I think the best book on Congress and not necessarily reform is Pivotal Politics, A Theory of U.S. Lawmaking by Keith Crable. This is a book that when I read it, I read it twice, right once and then the next time, because it made me not be mad at Congress at all. It was kind of like, oh, all right, this is a math problem, and we just got to figure out where all these people agree on and where they don't and figure it out. And so it's not something where I'm ever angry that this outcome didn't happen. I'm like, oh, didn't have the votes here, or oh, that's just not where everyone's sitting. And so I think, when you kind of understand that, it makes it so you just have to reform the people who are in there, and then you get to those outcomes. But it kind of shows, here's what you're going to get. Here's the veto pivots. Here's what happens. Oh, all right, really reasonable. It totally took any sort of anger, ire, anything out of me for Congress, and I just don't have it anymore. My students are always like, why aren't you mad about this? I'm like, I mean, that's the numbers. That's the people who are there right now. That's what's going to happen. That person gets nominated. That person gets elected. That person passed. Yeah. So I love pivotal politics.
Great. Well, last question is really about, the future direction of your research. Obviously, you're working on your book, and what else do you have coming up on the horizon?
Sure. So I'm always going to run DC Inbox. I think for as long as I'm alive. I don't have any grad students. I don't have a plan for when that run is over, but DC Inbox is my bread and butter, my daily tie into this stuff. So I think I know that that's always going to be a part of what I'm doing. I think now that I'm post tenure, sort of situating what I want to do and more of what is an impact that I can have versus what's publishable is sort of the decision making that I'm using. And so getting more into this space about how young adults and older children and adolescents can think about politics, that's stuff that I'm very excited to do. That's stuff that I think is not necessarily privileged in academia as the prestigious place to be, but it is something that I think matters to me. And it's something where I know that we only get better if we have more people who care about it. And so that's probably where the next chunk of my big pushes goes. I'm on sabbatical for a year now. And so I have, time to kind of figure out how that space operates for me and what I do there. But I think long term, it's going to be this communication thread and then this getting people into the system thread.
Professor Cormack, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure and best of luck.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really nice, and I'm glad that you're doing this sort of work.
Thank you.